I know how much you guys like those driving away shots that I do. Switched it up on you this time. A rival shot, huh? So you can't be like, Andrew, you forgot your camera on the roof over there. You drove away without your camera. What are you gonna say this time? Just on the waiting list for the 2.5. Should be first up, shouldn't be too long. I'm gonna keep it a short session today because one or two things to chat about afterwards. So, usual drill, in for 1,000, 2.5, no limit, Texas Hold'em. All right, so that ended up being even shorter of a session than I was expecting it to be because the game broke. Playing five-handed for a little bit there. Almost exactly nothing to report. Lost $135. I even had pocket aces one hand and opened on the button. Raised to $15. Small blind just ships all in there. Just jams it all in for $65. I call and scoop that huge pot. But then there was like 5 other hands where flop middle pair, call a c-bet, have to fold later on, something like that. And yeah, lose $135, but gonna move on. Gonna go over to the Bellagio and go check out the 5-10 games. I pretty much always use the valet, but I really wanted to get that elevator to elevator shot, so self-parked today. It's the little things in life, you know? As you can tell, it's now late outside, it's daylight. We are no longer at the Bellagio. Back in my apartment, and it's the next day. It's the day after what you just saw, which is Tuesday. Previous day was Monday. So there's a couple things I want to discuss. We're definitely gonna go over a couple hands, but there's a question that keeps coming up in the comments, and it's in reference to something that I keep talking about in the videos, which is the topic of game selection. And what I usually say is, such and such game didn't look that great, or I'm going to keep my eye on the other stakes and see how they look, see how those games look. This game looks good, this other game doesn't look that good. And the question that always comes up is, what criteria do you use to decide whether a game looks good or doesn't look good? They say, obviously, when you're playing in Vegas at your normal games, you know, you'll obviously recognize a lot of the regular players and it's easier, but when you're on the road, you don't know anybody, so what do you look for? So I could give you a list of things that I generally look for, and that helps a little bit. So there's some good signs and there's some bad signs. So if everybody at the table is wearing headphones or earbuds, watching something on their phone or their iPads, if they're watching a movie, if there's not a lot of conversation happening at the table, and everyone's just kind of quietly grinding and just passing the time, it appears, not a good sign. Obviously you want people playing hands and getting in there and gambling. Other things are pretty obvious, like you want some cocktails, those are a good sign. People have some cocktails on the table. Something that might not be so obvious and something that you kind of have to be on the lookout for in your game, it's not just up front and center. You want to have people playing lots of hands, and as a result, seeing lots of flops. A game that's generally good is a game that people are playing wide ranges, right? So if people are playing wide ranges, they aren't just sitting around knitting it up. So what happens when people are playing wide ranges? Well, you'll probably see a lot more limping because the hands that they're coming into the pots with generally aren't as strong. And therefore, a lot of limping might be a good sign that it's a pretty good game. And people are playing wide ranges, and a lot of times people will even call with these hands to a raise. So if you're seeing a lot of limping, a lot of calling, and you're getting a lot of flops that are going multi-way, pretty straightforward, right? It tends to make sense. If people are playing wide ranges, that's going to be a good game. If you have a bunch of people that are just knitting it up, waiting for aces and kings, there's not going to be too many multi-way flops because that's the only hands that those people are playing. So that's pretty much it. There's no real science to it, I guess, aside from determining how people playing wide ranges affects poker hands and multi-way pots. You just generally want a social atmosphere. You want things that go along with that social atmosphere, such as chatting and occasional beverages, and you want people in there gambling. So is it entirely up to these people to provide that for you as a professional? No. I mean, I think as a salesperson, as I tend to think poker players generally are, I think there's lots of things that you can do to encourage that sort of an environment. Engage people in conversation, start conversation, have a beer if you see someone having a beer. Not saying you have to start doing shots and, you know, really indulging, but just be social. And my personal favorite, don't be afraid to put that straddle on. I know a lot of poker players shun the idea of the straddle. It's negative EV and all that stuff. It might be, but if we can turn a somewhat boring game into a somewhat good game, I think it's worth it. So, things to consider. So this really applies, actually, to the game at the Bellagio last night. The must-move game was decent, and then the main game that I got moved into was well below decent. I was actually the only player at the table playing nine-handed. I'm the only player at the table not wearing headphones or earbuds, and half the table was watching something on their phone or iPad. Fairly miserable. And why would I stay there? That's a good question. I don't know why I stayed there. I did though. I stayed there, and actually the game got much better later on. That tends to happen sometimes. Sometimes the game will be so bad that it'll just implode on itself, and it'll end up becoming much better. But I don't know. A lot of times it's not worth waiting to find out if that's going to happen, and it's a really bad sign when literally every other person at the table is listening or watching to something and just obviously not that interested in doing some gambling. But you're about to find out that that's kind of the theme of my session from last night, is mistakes. And I think mistake number one for me was just not picking up and sticking through, deciding to play through this game. Not really sure why. Sometimes I just feel like I feel like the options are a little bit limited sometimes in Las Vegas, and I know the game selection for 5-10 and above isn't going to be super ideal. So maybe I just get stubborn sometimes and just decide to play through it. But that kind of sets the scene for the evening. So let's get into some hands here. All right, I gotta go inside because even though this is gorgeous, right now, every day around this time, there is a parade of helicopters that come back from the Grand Canyon, and they have this sunset, this magical sunset return to the Strip, which is actually, must be super beautiful, but it doesn't exactly make for good recording. Okay, so one more thing about that whole salesperson analogy for the poker playing, game selecting thing. So I've been listening to a lot of Gary Vaynerchuk lately, and if you don't listen to him, I highly recommend you do. He's not a poker player, but he's got an awesome YouTube channel, and I've been really into his stuff lately. So one thing that he had a question that somebody asked him recently, how do you handle a sales call or what have you? How do you handle making a sale to someone who is telling you no? And his response is you move on and you find other people that are much more willing to listen to what you have to say and are interested in your product. So let's say you are selling anything. Say you're selling vitamins. Are you going to try and sell vitamins to other vitamin salespeople when they already know what you're going to say about your vitamins before you even say it, and the fact that you are trying to sell something that they are also trying to sell? You're probably not going to do too well. So that's kind of how I approach game selection, and I don't know, just an interesting analogy, I thought. Okay, so anyway, let's get into some hands here. And yeah, even though this might be a little bit difficult for me, I'm gonna do it anyway. So first hand comes while we were still at the must move game. The main game was the game that I was kind of talking about, how everyone was just kind of doing their thing with headphones on and what have you, but still in the must move here. And the under the gun +1 player opens for 40. And I guess I can say he's a limit player who was having some cocktails, seemed to be just kind of having a night out, so to speak. There's an early middle position player who calls, who is a reg. I call just behind him with king queen offsuit, and there are 2 more calls behind me. So we go 5 ways to a flop. Flop seems mostly favorable. Flop is king queen 9 with 2 clubs. So we flop top 2 pair. The initial raiser puts out a c-bet of $300. Overbets the pot. The middle position player thinks for a little while and then he calls. So already a very weird, unusual situation here. Top 2 pair on a connected wet board. 2 other people behind yet to act, and the initial raiser showing a lot of strength, and middle position player showing decent amount of strength by calling an overbet. So not too sure what the best line on the flop is, but I just decided to flat call and just kind of evaluate as the hand unfolds, see what happens behind me and on the turn. So I call, and the 2 players behind me fold. 3 ways to a turn card, which is a total brick. The initial raiser shoves all in, but he's got $700, so not really an overbet. Jams all in for 7, maybe 750, something along those lines. Middle position player goes into the tank a little bit and looks at my stack and is thinking it over, and then he decides to go all in as well. So he covers me, and I have about 1150-ish at this point. Pretty interesting spot. Top 2 pair. I feel like my hand could be a little bit under repped. Maybe not, because the c-bet was an overbet of $300. So he can never be bluffing, obviously, because he has to win at showdown versus the initial raiser. The problem is that the hands that we beat, that he could maybe have in his range, we block. So we block queen 9, we block king 9, and we don't block jack 10, and we don't block pocket 9s. That makes it somewhat close of a situation. Top 2 just feels good, you know, feels good to flop top 2 pair. It's a question of whether he has queen 9 and king 9 in his range. And thinking back, after I made my decision, which was to call, and without even thinking about it for too much for some reason, thinking back on it, I don't think he has enough hands in his range to merit a call here. He has to A, call with queen 9 and king 9 from middle position versus an early position raise, and we also block those hands. He somehow has to still have those hands after we are blocking them. I think it should be a hero fold here in this situation, after thinking about it after the fact. Perhaps not even because it's a results-oriented way of thinking about it, because as it turns out, initial raiser has pocket queens, middle position player has pocket 9s. We're pretty murdered here. We're not completely dead, but it's a pretty bad situation. So not a real big fan of my call here. Like I said, mainly for the reason of us not blocking the hands that beat us and only blocking hands that we can still beat. And it's unlikely that he called with those hands pre-flop. So Sometimes I think that I don't make good adjustments when I go from, say, a 2-5 to 5-10, or a 5-10 in one location such as California, where there just generally is more action, to a 5-10 in Las Vegas, where ranges are a little bit more snug on average, I would say. So I don't know, don't love my call. Board, we run it twice, board bricks out twice for me. So initial raiser, triples up, the middle position player wins a small side pot for me. And yeah, I'm off to a pretty rough start in this session. Whacked right after the bat, and I think it's a mistake. Next interesting hand comes with me looking down at ace king offsuit, and I raise it up to 30 from under the gun +1. Player in early middle position makes it 70, and this player is a very recreational, and very admittedly so recreational. Often talks about how happy he is to fuel the games, so to speak. Just enjoys his time there, and has had a very successful life. Doesn't care about money, you could say. So I only point that out for reasons you will see. And by the way, this is after the fact that the terrible game had kind of gotten much better, you could say. So anyway, there are 2 cold calls behind him from the button and the big blind. So when he 3-bets to 70 and these other players cold call, should be pretty evident that they don't have that strong a hand, because once they see that he puts in the 70, if they have a premium, they're looking to build up the pot and really play a big pot with him. So anyway, they cold call, and I'm looking to put in a pretty decent 4-bet size here. Try and thin the field, try and give some poor odds to players who are looking to set mine and, you know, flop favorably versus the 3-better. So I make a 4-bet and I make it $340 to go. The 3-better in middle position snap calls. The next player folds, and the big blind thinks for a little while, and then he makes the call. So we're going 3 ways here to the flop in a already fairly bloated pot. The flop comes 10-8 for rainbow. So the big blind checks, and unfortunately we whiff here. The other piece of information that you need to know is that the middle position player only has about 550 or 600 maybe at this point behind. So having whiffed the flop, and with him having a pretty short stack to pot ratio, I guess there's merit in c-betting. There might be some merit to it. Maybe the middle position player was playing this hand fit or fold, and if he has, say, a medium pair, like, I don't know, 7s perhaps, maybe he will be able to just let it go, and that could be an example of a better hand that will fold to a c-bet. But all that being said, with ace king, turning it into a bluff, I'm not sure would make the most sense, because with this player type in middle position, facing a bet with that much money in the pot, not too sure he's gonna be looking to fold pocket 7s here. So don't really love a c-bet, and for unknown reasons, I decide to c-bet. I bet $420. Middle position player thinks for a while, but then he folds. So that's some good news. The big blind, however, snap calls right away. Calls immediately, and we're off to a turn card. Turn card's pretty favorable, offsuit king. So full rainbow on board, and we make top pair, top kicker on the turn. So he checks it over to me, and at this point, I think it's a straightforward bet. Maybe he could have Jack 9 suited or something. There's a couple draw potentials there, straight draws out there. So looking for some value, I decide to put out a bet on the turn, and I bet $680, which leaves me a little over 800 behind. At this point, the big blind decides to jam all in for my remaining $800 to $850. Pretty miserable spot. The pot is now huge compared to what I have behind. Not a great situation. Just not loving it. Not loving the situation that I put myself in here. Hate my c-bet. Now that we've hit one of the best cards in the deck for us, feels like our hand is much better now. Feels like it's much more towards the top of our range. And with that little amount left compared to the pot size, coupled with the fact that I think this player is capable of making some different moves. I played with him, I played a decent number of hours with him before. In another video, he showed up with Queen 6 of spades or something or other when he opened from early position or early middle position. So he might not have the most snug of ranges out there, but what does he really beat here? What does he hope to accomplish here? If I happen to have pocket queens, pocket jacks, something along those lines, am I really gonna bet this turn card? Is he gonna push me off of that type of a hand with some sort of amazing bluff? I think I just got really lost in the hand between having the middle position player in there and me making a rather questionable c-bet on the flop and building a huge pot to this point and having relatively not much money left behind. So I call it off, decided to call it off, and we're drawing dead. The moral of the story is we're drawing dead to pocket tens. So this session, to say it's going poorly is a rather big understatement, and it's pretty much all my fault, I guess you could say. I pretty much only have myself to blame for it. Lots of head shaking in this session going on, really. So unfortunately, there's no real silver lining here to this session and to these hands. Just got whacked, got absolutely murdered in this session. And like I said, I don't really have too many other places to place the blame here other than myself. So the tally for the evening, let's see, comes to a loss of this much. Pretty gross, pretty frustrating. So what is there to be learned? Back to the drawing board. I sent both these hands over to the text group and got feedback, and I actually have thought about a couple of different lines that I could have taken with the ace king. I actually sent a couple different lines to the text group, and I sent things that I might have done differently because, for example, let's say the flop checks through and the turn is a king. Let's say the big blind checks. Let's say I bet 420. Middle position player folds, and the big blind, I suspect he might flat call. Let's say the river is a brick and he checks again. I don't know if I would have just checked back there. I think I might go for small value, and in the end I still lose a bunch of money. So either way, I was going to play it incorrectly. Of course it's unfortunate that he flop top set and we end up turning one of the best cards for us. So yeah, it's some run bad, but you can't just expect to only do well when you run good and just chalk up all your losses to run bad. The whole point of professional poker is maximizing your wins when you're running good and minimizing your losses when you're running bad. And I think I maximized my loss when I was running bad in that ace king hand pretty clearly, since I lost the literal maximum. So fairly, I want to say embarrassing, but I don't think that's the right word to really focus on, because it shouldn't have anything to do with that. Everybody's going to make mistakes. 100% of poker players are going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes every single session you play. And are you going to make mistakes of this caliber, this size? Hopefully not too often. And what is there to do? Well, share the hands with people that your opinions, whose opinions you respect, and you learn. So the upside is you guys can learn from my mistakes. So things to think about here with these hands. If you guys learn from them, that's awesome. I don't know, maybe the video will be cathartic for me in some fashion, but learn from my mistakes, don't play like an idiot, and don't call yourself an idiot, because it's counterproductive. And like I said, mistakes are going to be made. Unfortunately, they will be very expensive from time to time. Good news is, booked a couple of big wins prior to this session, and there will be more wins in the future. It's a learning experience. If you guys are learning from my mistakes, I'm happy.